Have you ever woken up in the morning with the strange and heavy sensation that your mind is like a small room, completely filled with thick grey smoke? And you see, I'm not simply talking about ordinary physical tiredness, that deep sense of exhaustion you feel in your heavy muscles after a very long and intense day at work, or perhaps after running a full marathon or a big competitive race. No, it is something else entirely. You see, I'm talking about something much more deeply nuanced, and at the same time much more paralyzing. I'm talking about that thick, suffocating mental fog that seems to settle heavily between you and the world around you. It's that persistent feeling that your reactions are incredibly slow, that your daily decisions feel as unbearably heavy as solid lead, and that joy, that natural, vibrant spark of life, has become a fading, distant memory, something almost entirely foreign to who you are today. Often, when we feel this way, our first reaction is to look for answers in traditional psychology, or worse yet, to seek them in medications that promise to balance the chemistry in your head, as if adjusting a precision scale. But today, as we finally wrap up our comprehensive three-part trilogy on the wonders of plasma, I am going to ask you for something just a little bit different. I would truly like you to look at all of that confusion and all of that inherent discomfort specifically through the professional eyes of a seasoned engineer. Think of your brain as if it were a high-resolution liquid crystal display. If the fluid is clean and the voltage is correct, the image that appears will be sharp and bright. But if the internal medium becomes viscous and filled with metallic interference, then the screen fogs up and the signal gets distorted. That's why I want you to understand that your mental health, and mine too, is not an abstract idea floating in the air, but rather the physical, tangible, and electrical state of your brain's plasma, and mine, of course. In other words, it's not that your mind suddenly breaks. What happens is that your biological environment may be losing its conductivity, and so that we can move forward together exploring this world of mental health, which is clearly connected to plasma, the first thing we need to do is agree on what mental health really is. Well, if we turn to official sources, and here the best is the World Health Organization, the WHO, they tell us that mental health is a state of well-being, in which the individual is aware of their own abilities and can cope with the normal stresses of life. Well, it's certainly a correct definition and probably also very necessary for society, but for us, it's a definition that only scratches the surface. Think about it for a moment. What does it mean to cope with normal stresses? For a person with a clean system, if a car suddenly brakes at a traffic light, it's simply a scare that passes in a minute. However, for an individual living with a heavily saturated nervous system, that very same minor scare can easily trigger an entire day filled with intense heart palpitations and overwhelming feelings of anxiety, irritability, mental block, or think about someone who forgets their keys at home. For some, it's just a funny story, but for others, it can be the trigger for a crying fit, a feeling of "I can't take it anymore." That distinct variation in response is not actually the result of a difference or any inherent deficiency in one's character. Rather, it stems directly from a fundamental difference in biological recovery capacity. From the perspective of biophysics, mental health is the homeostasis of your neural plasma, which means, in simpler terms, it's the ability of your internal environment, that sea that bathes your neurons, to maintain order, which in science, as you well know, we call syntropy, in the face of the noise, wear and tear and chaos of daily life. Today we're going to discover that you don't have to be a victim of your genetics, nor of a chemical imbalance that just appeared out of nowhere by bad luck, which is what you're often told when you go to a consultation. It turns out that you might actually be the chief engineer of a biological scenario that simply has lost its conductivity. And what does this mean for you? It could easily happen to you. It could certainly happen to me, or even to absolutely anyone else who unfortunately neglects the essential electrical maintenance of their own complex power system. Today you're going to learn how to clear the stage so your mind can shine again. Stay with me, because today the engineering of regeneration becomes something personal. And you'll see, we're not going to talk about psychology, and I'm not going to talk to you about psychology. I'm going to talk to you about why your plasma has become viscous and how that's what's dimming your joy. To understand why we lose that peace, which is so necessary, we have to talk about cleaning the central processor. And as I've told you on other occasions, especially in our series on the reconstruction of the cathedral, the brain is the most demanding organ in your entire system. It represents 2% of your body weight, but nevertheless, it consumes more than 20% of your total energy. It's an office that works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it does so at full capacity. And of course, like any office that never closes, and where there's always activity, it generates an impressive amount of waste. For a long time, official medicine believed that the brain was a magically clean place, and it was thought to be protected by a kind of impenetrable customs barrier called the blood-brain barrier, a structure made up of blood vessels and tissue that decides which substances can enter and which must stay out. This formidable barrier was supposed to keep us safe from any potential external threats. But today, thanks to modern research, we know that this customs barrier has leaks. And we also know that through these leaks, unwanted tenants slip in, acting as real saboteurs, electrical signals of your thoughts. And now let's talk about one of them, perhaps the main one, aluminum. But you'll see, I'm going to do it with the rigor that I believe this topic deserves. And I start with it because aluminum is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, and because we are literally surrounded by aluminum. You can find it in your everyday kitchen utensils, in many common hygiene products, in the very air that we breathe, and even in the fresh water we drink every single day. What happens? That its presence in our brains has grown exponentially in recent decades, and biopsies of patients with cognitive decline show us concentrations that really should make us think, that really should make us reflect. Aluminum is not just a residue that simply passes through. In biophysics, it behaves like an insulating material. And just think about it. Imagine your neurons as if they were high-fidelity cables, silver wires that need to constantly send electrical pulses so that you can remember a friend's name, stay calm in the face of the unexpected, or simply feel excited about the project. Well, if aluminum accumulates and is deposited in nervous tissue, and forensic studies have consistently confirmed that it has a remarkably strong and specific affinity for these areas, it turns out that it functions much like a biological cement that effectively blocks connectivity. As I mentioned, it behaves like an insulating material. That's right. It's as if you put electrical tape on the connectors of a state-of-the-art microchip. What happens then? The electrical signal can't get through. And if it does, it arrives distorted. In other words, it comes with noise. And that noise is what you perceive, for example, when you walk into a room and suddenly can't remember why you went in. Or consider those moments when you are carefully reading a full page of a complex book and, by the very time you finally reach the bottom, you suddenly realize that you haven't actually understood a single thing, simply because your wandering mind has been drifting off somewhere else entirely. It's that inability to maintain focus, it's that mental flicker that makes you feel like your brain is moving at one speed while you're moving at another. And here, I'm going to reveal an engineer's secret that very few people outside of biophysics labs know. Aluminum has a sworn natural enemy, an antagonist, that hates it at the atomic level. I'm talking about silicon. In materials engineering and in the semiconductor industry, we know that silicon is the absolute king. It's the material that allows information to travel at the speed of light in the microchips of your phone or your computer. But you see, there is something incredibly fascinating that we can observe and learn from our own human biology here. As it actually turns out, the elements of aluminum and silicon constantly compete for the exact same biological spot deep inside your cells. In other words, you can think of them as being like two puzzle pieces, both desperately trying to fit into the very same limited space, but ultimately only one of those pieces can win the spot. If your brain has an adequate and healthy reserve of silicon, and your plasma is well supplied with this important material, aluminum simply cannot take hold because silicon actively pushes it out, dislodges it, and forces it to leave the nervous tissue and enter the bloodstream, where it can then be eliminated from your body. You can think of it as though silicon were a protective layer of Teflon that effectively works to prevent that rigid aluminum cement from firmly adhering to your delicate neural wiring system. One of the most profound tragedies of our modern existence is that we are suffering from a critical deficiency of silicon, which is becoming increasingly scarce in the soil and in our daily diet, while at the same time, we have an overwhelming and dangerous surplus of aluminum. That is precisely why aluminum is triumphing decisively in a massive landslide victory within our cathedral, systematically stripping away our essential conductivity and our natural cognitive sharpness and mental agility. But for now, remember this name, silicon, because later in this video I'll explain how to use it. To regain your sovereignty and finally clear that fogged up glass you might have in your mind. And with that, let's return to aluminum again, even if just for you to know that it's not working alone. Aluminum has other partners in this sabotage. There are other metals that also sneak into your cathedral. So I'm talking about mercury, for example, which has a terrifying affinity for the fats that coat your nerves. There, its effect is devastating. It physically destroys the microtubules, which are the internal highways along which your neurotransmitters travel. You might ask, what are neurotransmitters? Well, they're the chemical messengers of your brain. They are substances like serotonin or dopamine that carry messages from one neuron to another. They are what allow neurons to communicate with each other. Imagine if the roads in a city suddenly collapsed. That's what your brain feels like under the effect of mercury. Without these highways, messages of calm or happiness get lost along the way. They don't arrive, they've sunk. Besides mercury, we also have, for example, lead, which is a true master of disguise. Lead takes the place of calcium in your synapses, and the synapse is the microscopic space between two neurons. It's the bridge where they shake hands to pass information to each other. When lead gets in the middle, what it does is block the release of dopamine, which is the molecule that drives your motivation and pleasure. That's why there are days when nothing appeals to you, when you've lost the spark for things you used to enjoy. And you see, this happens not because you're apathetic, but simply because your bridges are blocked by a heavy metal. This heavy metal acts as a physical barrier, preventing the natural flow of signals that keep your mind feeling vibrant and alive. It is a silent process that can deeply affect your daily mood and overall sense of well-being without you even realizing it. And when these metals accumulate, your brain plasma stops being that bright, conductive liquid crystal it should be and turns into a tangle of metallic interference. All this physical noise is the foundation of what you perceive as anxiety, as that knot in your stomach, as that feeling of being disconnected from your own life. You see, to get out of this jam, we need a key figure, Maiken Nedergaard. Nedergaard is a Danish neuroscientist and co-director of the Center for Neuromedicine at the University of Rochester. In 2012, after years of research using fluorescent tracers, she discovered something that completely changed medicine, the glymphatic system. And it's called that because of the glial cells and its lymphatic function. It's something like your own personal brain sewage system. And for you to really understand how it works, it's kind of like a cleaning service for your brain, with a very important technical feature you should know about. This device only has a specialized nighttime switch. That is to say, it only functions while you are asleep. And furthermore, it only activates when you finally enter the very deepest stages of your sleep cycle. During the day, this system is turned off because obviously the brain is busy processing information. And for the cleaning fluid, which is nothing more than filtered plasma of the highest purity, to enter the brain and do its job, it needs the neurons to make room for it. And it's only at night, during your deep sleep and in that phase, when your mind seems to completely shut down, that the miracle happens. It turns out that your glial cells, that is, the ones that act as architects, supporting the neurons, and are the true caretakers of neural maintenance, receive a biological signal and physically shrink by 60%. And here, just a clarification, I use neural to refer to everything related to your neurons and their environment. Well, as you can imagine, what I'm explaining to you is a true feat of engineering with absolute precision. When they shrink, they open up channels that during the day simply remain closed, and through these channels, cerebrospinal fluid is forced in, which washes the brain and carries away aluminum, mercury, and those toxic proteins like beta amyloid that stick to your neurons like sticky tar. But you see, the fluid can't just enter any old way. That fluid needs gates, and those gates are called aquaporin 4. They are microscopic channels made of proteins that act like true intelligent valves. And here, pay attention, because this is where the vital connection with your plasma's voltage lies. For this fluid to enter with the necessary force and be able to sweep away the waste, the plasma obviously needs to be fluid. And if your internal environment is oxidized with that, a high RH2, as I mentioned at the beginning of this series, which can be due to prolonged stress or poor hydration, makes the fluid become viscous. Just imagine trying to clean the gears of a wristwatch, but instead of using a fine light oil, you use a thick syrup. The fluid simply can't pass through the aquaporin 4 channels, which are the protein gates that regulate this cleaning flow. The sole purpose of aquaporins is to allow cleaning water to pass into brain tissue, and they can't filter syrup, they need fluid water. If the gates don't open, either because the fluid is too dense or because your circadian rhythm is disrupted by the blue light from screens and you haven't reached deep sleep, the waste stays inside your brain. And if the valves get clogged, the waste stays inside and rots. And from there, what it causes is brain inflammation, because what isn't cleaned gets oxidized. And a brain that doesn't get washed night after night is a brain that lives in a constant state of inflammation. And here's something very important. It turns out that cutting-edge psychiatry, with figures like Dr. Edward Bulmore from the University of Cambridge, author of The Inflamed Mind, is beginning to recognize that depression is not a problem of sadness, but rather it is the response of your brain to this inflammation. Bulmore explains that when the brain is inflamed, a defensive state is activated that essentially shuts down joy and activates fear. And that's why, to heal the mind, the first thing you need to do is make sure that aquaporin 4 channels can finally allow clean water to pass through. Brain inflammation is the ground where depression and anxiety grow and feed. Chronic. And it's not that you're broken inside, it's just that your cleaning system has simply lost the voltage it needs to flush the system. Once I think you've understood that the brain needs to be clean for electricity to flow, and that the sewage system discovered by Maiken Nedergaard is vital so that metallic debris doesn't short-circuit us. Now we have to ask ourselves the big question. And it's a question that might seem obvious, but it holds the secret to your vitality. The question is, where does that electricity come from? Because think about it with me. From an engineer's logic, it's useless to have perfect silver wiring, gleaming liquid crystal fiber optics, and the cathedral's hallways free of debris, if it turns out you don't have a power plant to supply the system. There's no energy. The most advanced hardware in the world is nothing more than a pile of inert junk. For almost a century, traditional psychiatry has told us that depression, anxiety, brain fog, or even more serious disorders like bipolar disorder are chemical imbalances. And they've made us believe it almost as if it were dogma. That the problem is that you're missing a bit of serotonin in one corner, or you have too much dopamine in another. They've treated us as if the brain were some kind of glass test tube where someone pours in random liquids and hopes that the mixture doesn't explode, and if possible, that it works. But today, that old paradigm is falling apart. And this isn't being said by fringe voices, but by scientists who come from the very heart of the official academy. And here I want to introduce you to someone who, for me, is fundamental for you to be able to regain your own peace, Dr. Chris Palmer. And you'll see, he's not just an armchair theorist, he's a prestigious psychiatrist, a professor at Harvard Medical School and director of the postgraduate department at McLean Hospital. He has spent more than 25 years treating the most difficult cases, those cases that no one else could solve. And after a lifetime of clinical practice, Palmer has published a treatise that is shaking the very foundations of his field, the foundations of his profession. It's called Brain Energy, and in it, his thesis is as simple as it is revolutionary, and I would like you to listen to it carefully. Every single type of mental disorder, according to his research, is fundamentally characterized as a metabolic disorder of the brain. And what does this mean for you today? That maybe you feel too weak to get up, or that you live trapped in a loop of anxiety that you can't explain. Well, you see, it means that the origin of your discomfort isn't in your personality, nor is it some kind of stain on your psychological record. The origin is in your mitochondria. Yes, it's important that you really consider what I'm telling you, because it's very likely that you'll suddenly realize that your fatigue isn't laziness as you thought. I'm going to explain now so you understand. What are these structures? What are mitochondria? And why are they the real protagonists of your mental health? And in mine, they are tiny little power plants that live inside each one of your cells. More than 1 trillion cells, think of them as tiny engines or rechargeable batteries. Their job is truly fascinating. They take the nutrients from what you eat and the oxygen you breathe, and through a chemical dance of astonishing precision, they turn them into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And ATP is the currency of life. It is the pure energy that your neurons need in order to communicate with each other. Without enough ATP, there is no thought, no memory, and certainly no sense of joy. And this is where the bridge to the biophysics of Louis-Claude Vincent becomes an indestructible tool. If you remember what we talked about at the beginning of this series, RH2 is the value that measures your electron pressure. That is, it measures how much electrical charge you have in reserve. Well then, it turns out that Dr. Palmer arrives at the same conclusion, but he does so from the psychiatric clinic. If your mitochondria fail, if they are not able to generate energy efficiently, the voltage in your brain drops below the minimum required. And now consider this analogy so you can understand what happens to your mind, because it's very simple. Just imagine a powerful state-of-the-art laptop that is desperately trying to run a very heavy and demanding professional design program, but then it suddenly turns out that the high-end computer only has a mere 5% of its battery life remaining to handle the entire task. And what's the first thing you notice? Well, the screen starts to flicker, then the cursor moves in jumps. Applications start closing all by themselves, or suddenly the system freezes up in a sort of infinite loop. Inside your complex brain, those specific software errors are exactly what we commonly refer to as mental symptoms. Imagine a single neuron that lacks the sufficient energy required to fire when it is supposed to, or one that becomes unstable and fires at times when it should not, simply because its mitochondrial battery is depleted. What it does is create an internal electrical storm, and that storm is what you perceive as a panic attack. Sudden, like anxiety that tightens your chest for no apparent reason, or like a deep gray sadness that seems like it will never end. Dr. Palmer explains something that will probably resonate deeply with you. Chronic stress, past traumas, or even a poor diet are not just psychological concepts. They are physical agents that shut down your mitochondria. You see, when you live under constant threat, whether it's real or imagined, your energy centers enter what we call a defense mode. They stop producing energy for life, that is ATP, and start producing free radicals to defend themselves. And this instantly raises your RH2. You are losing electrons at an alarming rate, and you are literally oxidizing your brain plasma. Therefore, being depressed means being physically depleted. It means having viscous plasma that prevents information from flowing and mitochondria that have shut down because they can no longer sustain the energy expenditure required to maintain your consciousness. Wake up. And that's why treating the mind only with words, even if they are very wise words, is sometimes not enough. This, imagine it, is like trying to convince that computer that was running out of battery to work faster just because you're giving it a motivational speech. It's not going to work. It's exactly the same in your head. First, you have to restore the voltage to the system. You have to heal the mitochondria so that the plasma regains its conductivity. Do you realize how deep what we're talking about is? I repeat, you don't have to be psychologically broken. It's more than likely that what's happening is that your power plant simply needs some precision maintenance. Your cathedral turns off the lights, not because the architect is missing, but simply because the dynamo is dirty and it doesn't have any fuel. But of course, if we accept that the problem is one of energy and metabolism, then the next question anyone would ask is, what materials do I need so that this battery never runs out? What is it that allows the mitochondria's engine to spin without squeaking? If the mitochondria Dr. Palmer talks about are the engines of your brain, now we have to ask ourselves this purely logical, constructive question. What materials are these engines made of? And what happens when the original replacement parts are missing? This second question is also important because you see, in any engineering project, we know that if there's an empty space in a precision structure, always, something will end up filling it. The laws of nature do not allow for an absolute vacuum. If the legitimate part isn't there, a biological squatter will occupy or take its place. And in your brain, that tenant usually turns out not to be a welcome one. And to understand why your mind can feel vulnerable, here I want to introduce you to one of the bravest and most rigorous researchers in contemporary psychology, Dr. Julia Druklik. Julia is, thank you. She is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand and is one of the most respected and cited scientists in the field of what we now call nutritional psychology. Dr. Druklik has dedicated more than a decade to researching something that, to the ears of conventional medicine, seems almost too simple to be true. And that is the complex and fascinating connection between essential micronutrients and various severe mental disorders, ranging from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder to anxiety or post-traumatic stress. And in her studies, which have been published in journals such as The Lancet, Dr. Rutledge has shown that our neurons are suffering from what she calls a, thank you, hidden hunger. You see, think about it carefully. It's not that we're lacking calories, because in fact we live in an age of overfeeding. The specific thing that our plasma is currently lacking of is the set of essential trace minerals and micronutrients that are absolutely vital for electricity to flow properly. And she explains that minerals like zinc, lithium, magnesium, or selenium are not just supplements that one takes. If you will, they are enzymatic cofactors. And what does this mean in simple terms? You might ask me. Well, imagine that your neurons are doors that need to open or close to let information pass through. Well, it turns out that minerals are the keys to those doors. Without the zinc key, your brain can't produce neurotransmitters. Remember, those are the chemical messengers. And it's those that allow you to feel calm. Without magnesium, your neurons can't relax after an electrical effort. And what happens is that they remain in a constant state of tension. And you see, this is where I want to revisit that great battle of biology that I already mentioned to you in other videos, the fight between Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp. Pasteur convinced us that disease is an external enemy, a kind of microbe or virus that simply attacks us. But Béchamp, who was a visionary, shared a much deeper insight with us. He told us that the microbe is nothing, and he emphasized that the terrain is everything. What is the terrain when we talk about mental health? The terrain is the state of your plasma, its purity, its pH, and above all, its mineral content. When your terrain is malnourished, when those essential minerals that we've talked about are missing, Dr. Rackledge says that this is when real gaps appear in your biological architecture, and this is where the real danger of heavy metals, which we mentioned at the beginning of the video, comes in. Look, pay attention to this mechanism because this is pure materials engineering. The human body is so intelligent that in its drive to survive, if it can't find the right material to carry out a vital function, it uses whatever it has on hand. This is what we could call an emergency substitution. So if your neuronal receptors are lacking the zinc or calcium they need, elements like lead or cadmium, which happen to have a similar atomic structure but are toxic, can trick the system and take their place. It's as if in a cathedral, the original ashlar stones suddenly went missing and we started filling those gaps with something else. Instead of using stones, you fill it with rubble and poor quality cement, and at first it seems like the structure still stands. But that cement will eventually give way, and that aluminum, which takes the place where silicon should be, is actually a true electrical insulator. Remember, it doesn't let the light from your biophotons through. It doesn't allow the electrical signal of your thoughts to pass. And what happens then? Well, the terrain turns sour, it oxidizes, and this is where what we call pleomorphism appears. That is, your own internal microorganisms change their shape and function in order to try to survive. In an environment that is intoxicated and poor in electrons, they begin to generate their own waste, their own toxins. This chemical change in the terrain of your brain is what you perceive as a loss of mental sovereignty. This is when you become more irritable, when your fears become completely irrational, and when you lose your patience over nothing as well as your ability to recover. When faced with life's problems, it turns out that your resilience is depleted. And it is not necessarily the case that your soul is sick. It is quite simply a matter of the fact that your internal terrain has been overtaken and occupied by heavy metals, because there just were not enough essential minerals available to properly defend and maintain its rightful position. That's why mental health begins with recovery, the mineral integrity of your plasma, and this is not just a matter of health. In general, it's a true rescue operation so that aluminum and all those sabotaging allies have nowhere to latch on. What you need is to return the original stones to your cathedral so that the electricity of your consciousness can flow again without interference. And now that we know we need to cleanse the terrain and recover the materials, the question is, who is in charge of giving the final order? Who has the power to change things from above? The vibration of this scenario. Wow, we've been on quite an intense journey, haven't we? Wow, what a beating we're giving ourselves. I've talked to you about cleaning the corridors of your cathedral, about the building materials provided by plasma, and about those power plants, the mitochondria, that fuel each of our thoughts. But now comes the question that changes everything. The question that separates the passive spectator from the one who is truly the chief engineer. Who is the architect? Who coordinates this work? Who is the one who decides? Ultimately, Who decides whether your mitochondrial engines will work at full capacity or if they'll shut down from exhaustion? And this is where I want us to revisit an absolutely masterful figure, William James, at the end of the 19th century. And at a time when medicine was beginning to obsess over seeing the body as if it were just a simple machine made of flesh. James, who is the father of modern psychology in the United States and was a professor at Harvard, already sensed that the mind and body were a single, indivisible unit. James left us with a revelation that today, if we read it with the eyes of engineers, takes on a truly remarkable technical meaning. Astonishing technical insight. He said, "The greatest discovery of my generation is that a human being can alter his life by altering his mental attitudes." And for a long time, this phrase, which you have surely read, remained in philosophy books or was used as a simple self-help motto. But today, thanks to cutting-edge biophysics, we know that James was not talking about empty positive thinking. He was talking about the biophysics of intention. You and I are self-programmable organisms. Your mind is not magically floating above your brain. Your thoughts are physical commands, pulses of information that bathe your plasma in real time. And here comes the question, how does a command travel from your consciousness, something that seems immaterial, all the way to the depths of a cell? How does a feeling become a change in your DNA, which is clearly something material? Well, to understand this bridge, let's go back to Russia and remember the work of an absolutely visionary scientist, Peter Garayev. Garayev was a doctor of biological sciences and an academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And today he is considered the father of wave genetics. His work demonstrated something that completely breaks the mold of official biology. DNA is not just a digital storage device with simply static, inaccessible data. Garayev discovered that DNA functions as a biological antenna and a holographic computer capable of receiving and emitting information through light and sound waves. And here a technical term appears that I want you to understand well. The soliton. Garayev discovered that when we think or when we speak, we are generating solitons. You see, just imagine a wave in the middle of the ocean. Normally, waves disperse and break, losing their strength. But a soliton is like a special kind of wave. It is a wave that, due to its geometry, is capable of traveling thousands and thousands of kilometers while maintaining its shape, its height, and its energy, intact, without deforming. In your body, your thoughts are solitons of information that travel through the liquid crystal of your plasma. And when you cultivate a mental state of fear, complaint, or constant anguish, what you are doing is sending solitons of chaos to your DNA antenna. If you change your state of mind, you're not doing something abstract. What you're actually doing is clearing the background noise so that your mitochondria can receive the correct activation signal. And this isn't mysticism. This is about the voltage that Palmer says we lack in depression, which can only be maintained if the water in your cells is ordered, and that order isn't dictated by a pill. It's dictated by your software, in other words, your thoughts. It's like trying to read a beautiful poem through a glass covered in mud and grease. The poem is perfect, the letters haven't changed, but because of the grease and the dust, you can't see them. Regaining your sovereignty means understanding that you are the chief programmer, and by changing the frequency of your intention through the coherence of enthusiasm, and remember here that enthusiasm means having a God within, you allow your physical architecture to retune itself to the page of regeneration and stop being blocked on a page of survival. This, as you can understand, is something revolutionary for mental health. Illness is not a mistake in the genetic code. The blueprint for perfect health is still there and remains intact, stored in the DNA. The problem is that mental noise, those interferences I mentioned to you, often prevents your biology from reading the correct instructions. With what I'm telling you, you have stopped being a victim of chemistry and can now become the master of the frequency of your own life. But of course, after all this talk about light and thought engineering, surely, if you still have the energy, you must be wondering, but let's see, Jose Maria, all of this normalized. False, but sounds like an absolutely immense power, but how do I actually put it into practice tomorrow when my alarm goes off? That is, how can I, in a practical way, start to reprogram my system if today I feel completely down? Get yourself ready right now, because I am finally going to move away from simple theory and start taking some real action. I'm going to provide you with a specific protocol that has absolutely no connection to what you've heard up until this very moment. And you're going to discover the exact method to tune your antenna properly. After this whole journey through biophysics, metabolic psychiatry, and wave genetics, I imagine you feel as if you had in your hands a bunch of pieces from a fascinating puzzle. But it's a puzzle that's useless if the pieces don't fit together and the system doesn't get going. What I'm about to give you now, understand this, are not your typical health tips. They are neural tuning operations. This is the technical protocol so that your biological antenna stops receiving that static that exhausts you and starts receiving a signal of peace. And to understand this protocol, for a moment, we're going to have to turn to a key figure in neuroscience and modern psychology, Dr. Stephen Porges. Porges is a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and is the creator of the polyvagal theory, a line of research that has revolutionized our way of understanding stress and anxiety. Porges explains to us that our nervous system has a safety switch and that it is fundamental, a switch called the vagus nerve. And you'll see, I use the word vagus not because this nerve is lazy, but because it wanders or because it travels through much of your body, connecting the brain with the heart, the lungs, and the digestive system. What Porges teaches us is that if that switch is set to alert or defense mode, it doesn't matter what you think or what you eat, your mitochondria, they won't produce repair energy and your brain won't shrink to be cleaned. Why? Because you're in survival mode. That's why the first step in our daily engineering is calibrating vagal tone. And here, it's not about doing relaxation exercises by sheer willpower. What it's really about is sending a direct electrical signal to the brainstem. And you'll see you can do this in a very simple way through what we call controlled thermal stimulation. It is actually remarkably simple and straightforward, just like splashing some refreshing and very cold water onto your face or the sides of your neck for a full 30 seconds of time. And if you do this, it immediately activates and triggers what physiologists call the mammalian diving reflex. This physical stimulus, the cold water, instantly resets the vagus nerve and tells your brain in a technical way, without the need for words, attention, the danger has passed. We can let our guard down. This is like the enter command that allows glymphatic cleansing. Thank you. That Dr. Nedergaard was telling us about can finally get underway. Don't rule out taking a shower that ends with cold water before going to bed. Because once you've pressed the safety switch and the brain knows there are no lions outside, what we need next is to stabilize the electrical signal of the cathedral. And this is where cardiac coherence resonance comes in. Many people think that the heart is just a pump that moves blood, but from biophysics, we know that the heart is the largest generator of electromagnetic field in our entire body. And that vast and complex field is not merely composed of simple energy. It functions as a sophisticated and true carrier wave for the specific information solitons that Garayev was describing to us in such great detail. Well, you see, if your breathing is erratic and shallow, your signal is pure noise, pure static. But nevertheless, if you practice resonance breathing, that is, if you inhale for 5 seconds and exhale for another 5 seconds, always through the nose and deeply, your heart enters into coherence. And in that state, the electromagnetic field of the heart becomes orderly and rhythmic, and through pure physical entrainment, it actually forces the brain to enter its own calm frequency. It's as if you were calibrating your home's modem so that the Wi-Fi signal reaches each neuron clearly. And it is exclusively within this profound state of coherence that your intention possesses the precise and powerful geometric structural strength necessary to effectively reorganize and structure the liquid water within your cells and allow Dr. Emoto's research findings to be realized. Palmer's mitochondria to recharge. But you see, for the tuning to be perfect, we have to remove that kind of metallic scale I mentioned at the beginning. And as you already know, aluminum and other metals act as insulators that break the signal. And here, your protocol must include what I call an ionic clearing. For this, you need substances with a specific geometry and charge. And for this purpose, zeolite or organic silicon are useful. You see, think of these substances as little cage-shaped magnets that travel through your plasma, and what they have is a very strong negative charge that attracts heavy metals, which have a positive charge. They trap them inside and then escort them out of your body in a safe way. And by removing this metallic noise, what you're achieving is cleaning the crystal of your neurons so that the light of your biophotons can once again cross the plasma and not get scattered. In other words, what you are doing is recovery. The conductivity of your consciousness, and ultimately for the health software to install correctly while you rest, what you need is electromagnetic silence. Let me remind you that your aquaporin 4 channels, those intelligent valves for brain cleansing, are regulated by the rhythm of melatonin. Melatonin is not just a hormone for sleep, it turns out to be the most powerful antioxidant in your brain. Well, if before going to sleep you expose yourself to the blue light from screens or the incessant noise of social media, apps, and all that, you are sabotaging your melatonin's voltage. And what you're doing is preventing the garbage truck from passing through your cathedral and picking up the trash. And now we come to your last engineering operation of the day, which should be the closing of the cycle. And it's 15 minutes of total darkness and conscious gratitude. Gratitude, as we've seen with the physics of intention, is not a poetic emotion. It's an authentic frequency of coherent tuning. By giving thanks as you fall asleep in that state, what you're doing is letting your DNA antenna tune in to the frequency of regeneration, and that's how it will remain for the next 7 or 8 hours. In other words, you're allowing your engineering to work for you while you simply rest. Well, this journey we've taken together through the world of plasma and light, and the mechanics of your mind finally gives us back ownership of our own lives. You can now stop being a victim of some mysterious chemical imbalance that no one can explain to you, and of course also of defective genetics that you supposedly ended up with as if it were some kind of bad card in a game. No, it's not like that. Now you know that you are like the chief engineer of a fluid, electrical, and vibrational system that possesses indescribable beauty and precision. Mental health is the highest expression of your biological sovereignty. by clearing the terrain of materials, by calibrating your vagus nerve so that the glymphatic system can cleanse your brain, and by organizing your inner light through the coherence of your thoughts, you are allowing the guest of that cathedral you inhabit, that is, your consciousness, to live in a place worthy of its greatness. With this video, I am closing our trilogy on plasma, but I also want you to know that in reality, we are not ending anything today. What I am doing today is opening a much bigger door. It is a door to a commitment that I am making with you and with this channel. From now on, I am going to fully enter the broad field of mental health, but I will do so through this new lens of biophysics, which is what brings us together on this channel. In the coming weeks and months, alongside biophysics content, I will explore why anxiety arises, how depression can be overcome from a biological perspective, how to recover the memory we thought was lost, and how to protect our young people in a world full of electromagnetic noise. And I am not going to do it from a therapist's couch. I am going to do it from the standpoint of the biophysics of regeneration. Let's work together to turn this channel into an instruction manual so that mental fog disappears forever, and so that those who need it can finally regain control to achieve peace. Because once you master the art of learning to tune your own internal antenna, absolutely nobody will ever be able to tell you what kind of music you should be listening to. Because you are liquid light. You are the architect of your own sovereignty. If you like the video and you think it could be useful to others, you would do me a huge favor by sharing it. You will help me spread knowledge so that more people stop being patients and can become masters of their own lives. And as I always say, go forward, always forward. And I'll read your comments. Thank you very much.